Morning to everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Daryl, for the introduction. Good morning, Professor Carl Poblador, to the other speakers in this forum, to students of AIMS, and as well as those in the maritime sector. So what I wanted to talk about today is on an anthropological examination on the roots of Filipino maritime culture and identity. So, okay, we all know that the Philippines is an archipelago. So we are made up of more than 7,500 islands. So the country is bounded by oceans and seas. And of course, within each island, there would be several rivers flowing into the seas. Because of this presence of several islands, different cultures emerged in different parts of the archipelago. According to Dr. Robert Fox, former director of the National Museum, he says that there are at least 106 ethnic groups in the country. And according to the Summer Institute of Linguistics, there are more than 180 languages in the country. And we have diverse religious traditions as well, such as Christianity, Islam, and indigenous Philippine religions. So we would have the impression that partly the our archipelagic character contributed to this diversity. However, we have shared cultural heritage as well. It really doesn't mean that we are different from each other. So there are basically two racial stocks in the country. If we are using phenotypic criteria, so Negrito populations and the Austronesian speaking populations. In terms of languages, almost all Philippine languages, with the exception of Chabacano and Filipino Sign Language, are part of the Western Malayo-Polynesian subfamily of the Austronesian family of languages. In the historic and prehistoric past, Philippine society was made up of riverine and maritime communities. So houses were built on stilts along riverbanks and along coastal areas. However, there was trade relationship among different islands and between lowland and upland groups. So cultural traits coming from lowland seep into the highlands and vice versa. And across different islands of the country, as well as in different parts of the region, such as Southeast Asia and East Asia. So it's not really uh, isolated communities, but we are linked with one another. So I mentioned the Austronesian peoples. So if this is a map of the world, showing the distribution of Austronesian speaking populations in the world. So from Easter Island in the east, or Rapa Nui, which is now part of Chile, to Madagascar in Africa. And you will notice that the Philippines is more or less centrally located, because according to Peter Bellwood, a linguist and an archaeologist, so the Austronesian peoples came from mainland Asia at the border of modern-day Thailand and China, went down into Taiwan, and jumped into the Philippines and bifurcated into two groups. One group going into Oceania, consisting of Micronesia, Polynesia, and Melanesia, all the way to New Zealand and Chile, as I mentioned, and the other group going as far as Madagascar in Africa. So we will notice that our languages are very, very similar with one another. For example, you mentioned the word anak. So it's also anak or anak in many Austronesian languages. And why were Austronesian peoples able to spread this vast territory? It's because the Austronesians are attributed to the invention of the outrigger boat o yung bangkang may katig. So we know, for example, Native Americans had their canoes. The Inuit or Eskimos had their kayaks. But all of these native vessels don't have an outrigger, which did not enable them to go into far-flung areas, crossing the seas and oceans. So being connected with the maritime world is actually as an Austronesian legacy. So according to Bellwood, he used the postulations of Robert Blust. Peter Bellwood forwards the view that Austronesians spread to Southeast Asia from South China via Formosa or Taiwan and to the Philippines. From the Philippines and northern Indonesia, Austronesians were bifurcated, one branch going westwards. I already mentioned this. Okay? However, there is another hypothesis uh, coming from Wilhelm Solheim. I'll talk about that later. So the Austronesian family of languages consists of at least two subfamilies. The Malayo-Polynesian languages, many of us are familiar with this, and Formosan languages, the languages in Taiwan. That is why it is assumed that Formosan languages, the languages of Aboriginal peoples of Taiwan, are much older than Malayo-Polynesian languages. So you will see here the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, all speaking Malayo-Polynesian languages. However, you will notice some parts of Vietnam, the red portion, actually this is Champa or the Cham peoples of central Vietnam. How is it possible that uh, a group of people from Vietnam speak an Austronesian language just like those in the Philippines and Indonesia? Of course, the connection was through the seas, and also earlier kingdoms in the region such as Champa and Majapahit were connected because of this sea routes. The other hypothesis comes from Wilhelm Solheim. Right now, I won't take a stand in the debate because that is not the purpose of our presentation. However, Solheim also highlights the maritime context of the Nusantao, what he called the Nusantao peoples. So Wilhelm Solheim II disagrees with Peter Bellwood in the view that Taiwan was part of the Austronesian movement. He said that pre-Austronesians might have originated in eastern Indonesia and southern Mindanao. So it's not from Taiwan, but from the southern part of the Philippines. And he called this the Nusantao people. Nusan, ibig sabihin, south, the islands, tao. Okay? So he identified the Nusantao as a maritime-oriented culture as represented by the Bajau of Tawi-Tawi, living in houseboats or houses built on stilts in the seas or along coastal areas. Okay, so let us look at the Sama Bajau peoples of the Philippines. Actually, they're not just found in the Philippines. Their traditional homeland is the tri-border of Tawi-Tawi in the Philippines, Sulawesi in Indonesia, and Sabah in Malaysia. So the picture on the right shows the Bajau houseboat known as the Lepa, and they move about uh, through a moorage group or a cluster of different lepa moving from island to island. Some peoples of this region are already settled in land areas, such as the Bajau of Sabah live. They're recognized as horsemen within Sabah, and basically their way of life is in the land. However, just like the Sama of Tawi-Tawi, different from the Sama Dilaut or the Bajau, they live on houses built on stilts. Okay. Now, based on folkloric traditions, and of course, I would like to stress that this is folklore and would not necessarily have a factual historical basis, such as the legend of the 10 Bornean Datus. The anthropologist H. Oatley Bayer used this story of the 10 Bornean Datus as a proof of his theory of the waves of migration. He used other folkloric and pseudo-historical evidences, the maragtas, which is now disproven as fact, to back up the story of 10 Bornean Datus. However, in anthropology, we recognize that folklore is indeed part of culture. People would develop their own stories as to where they came from. And in this story, these Borneans came to the country, to the Philippines, riding boats known as barangay or balanghay or balangay, which is more or less accurate. The 10 Bornean Datus only as a symbolic representation of early peoples that have migrated to the country, into the Philippines, and outside the Philippines. So, for example, of course, the term barangay later on became associated with settlements led by a datu. Now, if we go back to the Bajau, therefore, folkloric tradition would say they originated from Johor in Malaysia. One time at night, they tied their houseboats in a rock protruding at the sea. But when they woke up in the morning, they found out that they're now in Tawi-Tawi because this was actually not a rock, but a giant sea turtle. Again, we know there's no factual evidence for this, but it is a folklore that people believe where their traditions came from. Okay, so the seas connected us with one another. In pre-colonial Philippine society, the seas were not the barriers in the flow of peoples from one direction to the other. On the contrary, the seas served as the major highways during that time. Of course, in pre-colonial Philippines, we didn't have a wheel based on land. What we had was the pasagan, for example, being pulled by a carabao. But in terms of boat traditions, we have a lot. So if we look at this map of the Visayas, you will see, for example, Negros Island, where the western part that is Negros Occidental, Ilonggo speaking, just like uh, Iloilo across the sea. And the eastern part, that's Negros Oriental, Cebuano speaking, just like Cebu and Bohol. So the seas were not the barriers. What the barriers are were the mountain ranges that crossed Negros Island. This is repeated in many parts of the archipelago. For example, in Luzon, we have Batangas as a province, and across in Mindoro, we have a group of Mangyans who call themselves Batangan because in the pre-colonial past, they were one people. What about the rivers? The rivers connected inland waters such as the lakes to the seas. For example, the Pasig River connected the Laguna Lake with Manila Bay. In the very, very long past, the seawater from Manila Bay flows into Laguna Lake during the dry season, while during the wet season, the water from Laguna Lake drains into Manila Bay. That is why Laguna Lake was then constantly uh, uh, had a rich source of salt water, which was favorable to the fish in the area. However, during the time of the Marcos dictatorship, they set up the Mangahan floodway, the Napindan Dam, and this uh, blocked the flow uh, of the Pasig River to drain into Manila Bay because Marcos didn't want Malacanang to be flooded. Okay, so this is a list of several watercrafts in the study of Ricardo Galang in 1941. So I have the manuscript here. Galang of the National Museum then looked at various archival sources that mentioned watercrafts in the Philippines. I won't be able to discuss all of them because I have very limited time. So it's the type of boats is spelled out alphabetically from A to Z, and you will see there are indeed many types of watercrafts in the country. Some of the names are obviously Spanish. I did not remove them from the list because we know that even during the Spanish colonial period, there were instances where indigenous crafts, indigenous cuisine, and other traditional items adopted Spanish names. So we would have to investigate whether they indeed were of indigenous origin or introduced by the Spanish, or was it just the name that was introduced? So from Galang's work, this is a plate showing the picture above is the barangay, which was described in historical sources as a sharp, slender craft pointed at both ends and put together with wooden nails and pegs and propelled by oars and sails. And it was widespread in the archipelago, even among uh, the Isnags of Apayao. Their boat, which is inland in the Apayao River, is called barangay. The picture below is a casco. So it's a long, almost rectangular barge or lighter than a barge, sometimes with sails, and principally used for loading merchandise. So, for example, I live in Pasig, and one of the old rivers in Pasig, now a creek, is the Parian River or what we call bitukang manok. And many of the heritage houses along the bitukang manok had a quote-unquote garage for a casco. Now, of course, there is no use for these garages. Now, let us look at different facets of life of early Filipinos prior to the coming of the colonizers and upon the coming of the colonizers. So, we know that pre-colonial houses were built on stilts, just like the Sama. The picture on the left are houses on stilts in Davao Oriental. And even our pambansang bahay, the Nipa hut, is house built on stilt, but now it's based mainly on land. But the tradition originated and evolved from houses along riverbanks and along coastal areas. Many peoples of the Philippines, in terms of their ethnic names, are marked by their water origins, whether the seas or the rivers or the lakes. Various peoples of the Philippines have been called as Tagalog, or people of the river, Kapampangan, people of the coast, Dumagat, people of the sea, Subanan, people of the river. Suba in Visayan languages means river. Tausug, people of the current. Maranao, Ranao meaning lake, people of the lake. Iraya Mangyan and Iraya Isnag, people of the upstream. So we will see that water bodies are really seen as very important for early Filipinos. What about food? Traditionally, Filipinos or pre-colonial Filipinos and continuing up to the present, we eat rice as staple food and traditionally fish. Rice, which Tagalogs call kanin, comes from the word kainin, which means to eat. Therefore, to have rice means you are eating. If you're not having rice, then nagpapapak ka. Hindi ka kumakain. Okay? If you're eating a particular dish, not with rice, but with liquor, namumulutan ka at hindi ka kumakain. Fish, among the Tagalogs, is called isda, but let us look at a cognate in the Ilocano language, sida, which means ulam. So, to have ulam is to have fish. And of course, Jose Rizal mentioned that among his favorite dishes was sinigang na ayungin, the fish coming from Laguna Lake. But ayungin is now extinct in Laguna Lake. The picture on the right is a mid-19th century photograph from painting, Jose Honorato Lozano, showing how Filipinos ate then with rice, sitting on the ground, having the dulang or the low table, and of course, rice being served. What about washing and bathing? So according to Jean Malat, a French geographer who wrote about the Indios of the Philippines, he said, the Indios, men as well as women, take the greatest care in everything that has to do with cleanliness of the body, and perhaps the former, meaning the men, more than the latter, more than the women. They take a bath and wash themselves every day in the river and at least twice a week at home. For them, it is a pleasure as well as a need. And we will see here a turn of the century photograph of people washing clothes as well as bathing along the Pasig River. Now, why is this mentioned by Mala? Mala is a Frenchman. And the French don't take a bath every day. They just put perfumes on their body. So for them, this is something new. Why do people take a bath every day? The importance of the river is seen in this description. And of course, aside from taking a bath every day in the river, once they go home, at least twice a week, they take a bath at home using the banga or the jar filled in with water and using a tabo made of coconut shell and gugo used as shampoo. The river was also the location where male circumcision rituals were performed. In traditional Philippine society, Filipino males were circumcised. Circumcision was not introduced by the Spanish, but this was a pre-colonial tradition. The Spanish were not circumcised, they were supot. So that's why Filipinos laughed at the Spanish. Male circumcision rituals were usually performed beside the rivers. After the foreskin of the penis is cut, of course, you spit chewed guava leaves on your penis and then jump into the river to be cleansed. And the picture on the right shows how the pukpok ritual is performed. Of course, many millennials and those of Generation Z uh, are no longer familiar with this ritual. Why is it called a ritual? Because it's a rite of passage to manhood, and only males could observe it. Females are forbidden to watch this ritual because it is believed that once a woman sees you being circumcised, then it will be nangangamatis or it will swell. Uh, so I mentioned that I live in Pasig. Members of the generation of my parents were circumcised beside the Pasig River and jumped into the river. However, in my generation, we could no longer do that because the Pasig River is already polluted and you could die by jumping into the river. Now, there were many stories also about the rivers that were connected to the seas. This story comes from an Isinay story of Aritao in Nueva Vizcaya. So it tells a story about a river sirena. Now, why is this interesting? We know that the concept of a mermaid or sirena was borrowed from the Spanish, from the European sirena. However, European mermaids were found in the seas and not along the river. But in the Philippines, in Cagayan River, as well as in other rivers in the island and in the archipelago, have been located along the rivers because the rivers are connected to the seas. Burial tradition. So let me go fast here because I have little time left. We will see from the Manunggul jar circa 890 BC that the lid that covers the jar, the secondary burial jar, shows the dead crossing his arms, being brought to the afterlife using a boat. Okay? So the afterlife or yung kabilang buhay ay is reached through a river connected to the seas, and then you reach the afterlife. Here is an example of boat-shaped burials in Batanes. The dead is buried inside a secondary burial covered by a heap of stones but the heap of stones are shaped like boats, again representing the belief that the dead will go to the afterlife, emulating their ancestors who are seafarers. Now, what changes have occurred due to colonization and modernization? There was a gradual shift, and to a certain degree, a forced shift from coastal and riverine communities to land-based towns or pueblos. The Spanish didn't want that early Filipino communities were strongly influenced by the rule of the datus as well as the influence of the Babaylan, the shamans, the indigenous shamans. So they built pueblos from far from the rivers and the seas. And if you remain in old settlements, it would show as if that your loyalty is with the Babaylan and not with the Spanish. So that was why the earliest revolts were the Babaylan revolts. The Spanish also established road networks and land transportation systems. They brought the wheel in the Philippine setting. On the contrary, sea transportation gradually declined. It was not eradicated by the Spanish because there was a galleon trade, but there was the establishment of port areas in Cavite, in Manila, in Zamboanga. But eventually, there was a decline because of the presence of land transportation and bridges and the tranvia, etc. But towards the American period and in the post-colonial era, we could see the eventual death of the maritime industry, especially the shipbuilding industry. In the past, the Philippines was known to build ships, but now we don't have this industry anymore. The industry that we have is to produce seamen that are sent abroad, but in terms of building ships and ocean vessels, uh, we have lagged behind in this endeavor. And of course, one impact of of modernization in particular is the pollution of rivers and creeks and rendering river transportation and sea transportation impractical and useless. So the river ferry, for example, along the Pasig River has become dead. There has been several instances that they wanted to revive it, but it's no longer there. And now, even they wanted to introduce building a road network known as the Parex on top of the Pasig River, practically uh, impacting on the Pasig River as a cultural heritage site. So here are my concluding remarks. Many facets, many culture traits of part of that were part of Philippine culture evolved from our maritime roots. However, many of the acculturated Filipino have become divorced from these roots. Because of this, our maritime industry has largely remained underdeveloped. If we want to redeem Philippine culture and identity, there is a need for us to redeem as well our connectedness with the maritime world and the maritime worldview that Filipinos have. So with this, thank you very much. And here are my references from Bayer, Castro, Galang, Mala, etc. If you have questions and comments, you could write it at the chat box. If we don't have much time, you could send me an email at mtcastro1@up.edu.ph. You could also watch my videos at YouTube. Look for Nestor Castro. Thank you very much.